Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And it's time for a starter pack, where I'm going to recommend you guys a bunch of albums that you can kind of get a taste of, try out if you wanted to get a grip on a particular genre of music or sound. In this video, we are talking about synth pop, synthesizer pop, which since its inception has been a lot of things as it has evolved, but I'm going to be sticking mostly with the albums and the artists that were some of the biggest, most relevant, most pivotal to the genre and culture during the genre's heyday from the 70s to the very early 90s. Not going to be talking about any like 2000s or contemporary stuff outside of records that throw back to that classic sound. So let's get into it. I mean, synthesizer pop, for the most part, is just simply pop music, but obviously very synthesizer heavy, usually bringing some electronic drums and stuff into the fold. Basically, you had this era of music post the 70s, post hard rock, post disco, where you had things like drum machines and synthesizers becoming more commercially available or becoming more of a permanent fixture in the modern, big-time, major label music studio, and artists started to make use of these instruments. Now, keep in mind what artists like, and this isn't a synth pop band, but Tangerine Dream, a progressive electronic group, progressive rock group known for their use of synthesizers in their music. During the early days when they incorporated a lot of this synth instrumentation into their work, they ran into a lot of technical issues because the technology was not quite what it was today. So in order to make the music that these artists did, they had to get pretty creative with how they assembled a lot of this stuff and performed it. And you know, it's really just kind of amazing taking a trip back in this style of music because, I mean, not only does it sound great, the artists that I'm recommending to you and these records are top-notch, great records, awesome from front to finish, from front to back. But on top of it, it's really cool to go back and hear the evolution of how a lot of this synthetic instrumentation used to sound. I mean, these days you can pretty much make any and every sound that you can possibly imagine, but there is a classic and sometimes an almost impossible aura to recapture that was present during this particular time in international pop music. So let's give it a bit of a go here. The first album I'm recommending to you is Yellow Magic Orchestra's Solid State Survivor. Yellow Magic Orchestra, Japanese band, and this is an intensely groovy, funky, quirky, and colorful album. Jesus Christ. This album is dancey as hell, and yeah, I feel like this record in a lot of ways is very much a precursor to a lot of the weirder synth music that would come out during the 80s. Of course, groups like Devo on the American side of things were present around the time of this album, but Yellow Magic Orchestra is not to be underestimated in the colorful eccentricity that they weaved into this fantastic album. Great track for track for track. There are some spacier and vibier tracks too that are pretty beautiful, but really it is the groovy and old school late 70s bangers on this thing that really kind of win me over on this record and make it a standout synth-pop album. Because for a synth-pop record that is so early in the genre's lifetime, Yellow Magic Orchestra's sound, their production, does not sound rudimentary at all. A lot of these earlier synth-pop groups did have kind of a rough sound, and maybe they didn't layer the synthesizers as creatively or as densely as some of the artists who were big in the genre and the records that they made did in the late 80s and early 90s. But Yellow Magic Orchestra, this record feels so ahead of the curve. It could have easily dropped in the late 80s or the early 90s, and I would have just believed you, given just how punchy and lush the production on this record is. So do give this a shot. Highly recommended. Very fun, very entertaining album. Moving on from there, a modern recommendation, which I hope you guys have listened to at this point, as it is one of my favorite albums of the year. I've given it a very positive review. MGMT's Little Dark Age, fantastic little synth-pop album that I think can really go toe-to-toe with a lot of the best records in the genre. Great songs, atmospheric, romantic, and very sensual production on this thing. It sounds gorgeous, it sounds lush, it sounds eerie, it sounds beautiful. Occasionally the group works in some elements of goth music and post-punk too, which play over pretty well as those styles of music. Very much bred with synth-pop in a lot of respects during their heyday, and a lot of other things too, but still. Yeah, solid record, great track for track, good tunes, great production, and good-ass synths on top of all of it. Next, one of the earlier synth-pop records in the list over here. This one dropped in 1981, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark Morality, or Architecture and Morality, rather. And yeah, this is a solid record. Early synth-pop record, obviously, with it dropping in the early 80s. It is a bit more rudimentary than a lot of the other records in the list that I'm recommending to you guys, but it really is the tunes, the chords, and the lead vocals that kind of sell this album. This is one of those synth-pop records, and this isn't the case for all of them, because you have dark synth-pop records, eerie synth-pop records, super romantic synth-pop records, but Architecture and Morality, and this is one of a few records in this list that I think applies to this, has kind of almost a futurist tone to it, which obviously wasn't that hard to attain. It was very much a conscious effort on the part of a lot of artists who embraced this more synthetic sound in the late 70s and early 80s, that this is the sound of the future, so we are going to make music that we feel embodies the future in some kind of way, shape, or form with this stuff. And yeah, it's just kind of a great record with a lot of solid tunes on it, super catchy. The synth sounds are analog, they're old school, they're fantastic. They're kind of quirky as well, but it does add to the cute personality of this record and the earlier days of OMD. So do give it a shot. Moving on from there, New Order's Power, Corruption, and Lies. Excellent synth-pop record. One of my favorite synth-pop songs of all time on this thing, Age of Consent. All I can really say about this album is that it's maybe my favorite synth-pop record of all time, and to me this album, which dropped in '83, embodies just about everything that I think a synth-pop record should embody. You have great straightforward tunes on here. You have some tracks that kind of build out into these extended dance mixes. There are some moments where the album itself is a little limited in that it feels like New Order are kind of employing some of the same like rhythms and synth sequences, because it seems like they're still kind of getting a full grip of the sound, the instrumentation, the whole evolution of this thing. And truth be told, it's not nearly as dynamic and I guess instrumentally mature as some of the material they would drop down the road. But I do like the somewhat rudimentary and bare bones sound that a lot of these classic synth pop groups brought earlier on in the genre's progression, because I do think it says a lot about how musicians had to try to alter the way that they wrote and assembled songs to play to the instrument and allow the instrument to kind of shine on their tracks. So Power, Corruption, and Lies, excellent record. Also love the vocals from Bernard Sumner on here, and you know, obviously fans should be well aware of, if they're not already, the Joy Division connections to New Order and so on and so forth. So excellent record. Again, maybe my favorite synth pop album, classic record, amazing record, a landmark album. Do give it a shot if you give any album in this list a shot. Moving on from there, another early synth-pop album dropping in 1979, Gary Numan's The Pleasure Principle. Definitely one of the more unique records in the list over here. Gary Numan, in the early days, was a one-of-a-kind artist, not just a one-of-a-kind artist in this particular genre. Sure, there are lots of electronics and synths woven throughout this album, but there are a lot of like guitars and rock influences flowing throughout this thing too. You guys also may be well aware of hit songs that Gary has made, like Cars. He's had a huge influence on other artists that have equally yelpy vocals, as for the time that he was pretty popular, he had a very uniquely vocals, kind of cracked vocal style. And the thing that's also special and unique about this album is that it also has a futurist tone like some other synth pop albums do, but with Gary's voice and some of the odd, abstract, and sour melodies that he would work into his tracks, there was something truly dystopian about the instrumentation, the songwriting that Gary brought to the table. Like, yes, it was very much futuristic, but there was something kind of dark and sad and alien and strange about that future that Gary created within his music. So, Gary Numan, Pleasure Principle, even to this day, with as dated as some of the instrumentation does sound, this album still conjures a very strange, futuristic tone that is pretty unique, pretty refreshing, and entertaining to listen to. And Gary himself, again, one-of-a-kind songwriter and singer. So, great record. Fantastic record. Moving on from there, Simple Minds. New Gold Dream. 81, 82, 83, 84. This is maybe not my favorite on the list over here, but I still think it's an essential synth pop album in that I feel like Simple Minds had on this album a uniquely spacious and groovy approach to their recording style that some of the other artists on this album didn't, because they were maybe more geared toward writing much more direct pop songs. And there are some very catchy songs on this record, but Simple Minds do take their time on some of these cuts, really building these songs out, layering out grooves, really kind of letting these grooves breathe. They're essentially kind of creating dance music on this thing, but with a very sensual and romantic tone. The vocals, again, I thought were a little weak in the songwriting. It's not the boldest and catchiest in this list, but I do think it is worth remembering and appreciating how closely connected a lot of synth pop music in the late 70s, early mid 80s was connected to the dance music scene. So do give this one a shot. Dropped in 1982. It's a pretty sweet record. Moving on from there, Behaviour from Pet Shop Boys. And this isn't even one of the group's earlier records. This one dropped in 1990, I believe. Yeah, this one dropped in 1990. And this is one of a few records on the list over here that I showcased because it's a later era synth pop record. By this time, the genre is super well established, especially artists like Pet Shop Boys, who have been dropping albums for a while, artists like New Order and Depeche Mode too. But this record is one of the most lush, immaculately layered, fantastically produced synth pop albums you're ever going to hear. Not only do the synths sound amazing on this thing, the technology in a lot of these synthesizers has improved, but you have the band working in things like these excellent sax solos. It's super sexy and lush and explorative, and the tunes are really solid as well. Cannot hate on the tunes at all. It's just immaculately produced. The production is gorgeous. It's just a gorgeous fucking sounding album. And that's the thing. With a lot of synth pop, there certainly was a very pointed focus on trying to make the music sound as lush and as beautiful and as pretty as possible. That certainly seems to be Pet Shop Boys' focus on this album, and they definitely achieve that because, again, gorgeous record, gorgeous sounding album. Moving on from there, a record that I love nearly as much, but not quite as gorgeous, a record that dropped in the early 80s, Soft Cell's non-stop Erotic Cabaret. A lot of you guys may be well aware of the song Tainted Love. Tainted Love. I hope you are. If you're not, please do look that song up because incredibly catchy, sexy song. And Soft Cell, again, earlier on in the 80s, not nearly as lusciously produced as some of the other artists in this list. I would actually say that this album, out of the entire list, is the roughest and the most rudimentary of all of the albums on this list. The drum beats on this thing are rough. Some of the synthesizers pretty rough. Some of the vocals pretty rough. But Soft Cell take that somewhat rough around the edges feel, and they have almost a punk attitude about it. And I feel like the duo explored some pretty dark and kinky themes with their lyrics and with their sounds that not a lot of other groups were at the time. Like, there was something supremely dark and carnal and sexual about this album that if that's redundant, you know, let me know down in the comments. I'm pretty sure it is, to say something is both carnal and sexual, but whatever. There's definitely something primal and sexual about this record that that made this album unique, you know, and obviously it lives up to its title with being a nonstop erotic cabaret. You know, again, while it may not have the brightest instrumentation and the catchiest, punchiest tunes on this thing, though fucking Tainted Love is really one of the greatest synth-pop songs of all time, so, you know, you can't really say that Soft Cell weren't on their songwriting shit. I do feel like the group does make up for it with this erotic and raw and sexy, and again, almost kinky personality that really is lacking on every other one of these albums. So if you want a synth-pop record that has a dark, kinky edge to it, give this one a shot. Moving on from there, Tears for Fears, songs from The Big Chair. You guys know this duo. Everybody wants to rule the world, and shout, shout, let it all out. You know those tracks. And of course, those hits are on this album, Tears for Fears, responsible for some of the biggest hits in the entire genre. And a lot like that Pet Shop Boys that I talked about earlier, I pretty much mentioned this Tears for Fears album because I think it is beautiful. It is immaculately produced. Record came out smack dab in the middle of the 80s, and I don't know, just all around sounds orgasmic, and a lot like many other synth pop groups and records that I've mentioned in this list so far, Tears for Fears on this record does have a supremely romantic sound when they want to go for that too. Again, like every other album so far, like many other albums so far that I've been talking about, luscious sound, gorgeous production, super sweet, sensual, romantic songs and singing. The vocals are kind of melodramatic on this record, and that's one thing that I think sticks out about this album and some of the best synth-pop albums in general. There is a strong and beautiful sense of melodrama on a lot of these albums too, and if there's any record that I put in this list that I could peg as the most wonderfully melodramatic, it would be this one. And finally, I'm going to give a nod to Depeche Mode's Violator, or when I met Nardwar, he was referring to them as Depeche Mode. But came out in 1990. Great, solid album. Great track for track for track for track. And Depeche Mode, especially with this album, marks one of the darkest corners of the synth-pop web, almost to the point where they're kind of bordering on, especially with cuts like Personal Jesus on this thing, they're kind of bordering on a post-punk thing, they're kind of bordering on a goth rock thing, they're even setting the tone for what artists like Trent Reznor would do on the Downward Spiral, not to take credit away from Trent's own personal progression though, because, you know, he was doing his thing already with Pretty Hate Machine, but still, this album is fantastic on its own merits, but in a lot of ways, Violator is the shape of rock and pop music to come in a lot of respects, which is, you know, great. Makes it a really cutting edge and amazing and catchy and wonderful album. Again, super dark, super eerie, almost tortured album at points, but Depeche Mode doesn't completely let go of that wonderfully synthetic and romantic and pillowy sound that a lot of great synth-pop records typically hold. So I think that is going to be the recommendation list. We have put the albums that I mentioned down there below in the description box. You can hit them up there, and there's some links to hear some music from the records as well. And I want to give a shout out to our sponsor in this video, the good people over at the Ridge Wallet. They make these excellent minimalist metal-plated wallets held together by a band. You stick your cards in there, you pop them out, you fan them out, real nice and convenient. I've been rocking mine for a few months now. I like it quite a bit. Hit the link in the description box to get your own with promo code Fantano, 10% off. And that is going to be it, guys. Hopefully you got some good recommendations out of this list. Love You, Anthony Fantano. Synth pop, Forever.